So when we start having problems with the thyroid, it can lead to several different diseases. If we think about the main function of the thyroid being producing thyroid hormone, we basically talk about two major conditions and some results of those two different conditions. One is hyposecretion, so not enough thyroid hormone production. The other is hypersecretion, so too much thyroid hormone production. And when you have hyposecretion, this can very often lead to what's called myxedema. And so you have low metabolic rate because, again, thyroid hormone causes metabolism. You can very often get thick or dry skin, puffy eyes. Sometimes there's chills, constipation, edema, which is going to be buildup of fluid in the local tissues. So often we see that as swelling because the local tissue gets excess fluid. Sometimes mental sluggishness and lethargy. Specifically, if the hyposecretion of thyroid hormone is due to not having enough iodine, we actually may develop what's called a goiter. All right, so this almost looks like it would be a tumor or something, but in fact, it's a buildup of the thyroid hormone precursors that cannot be fully synthesized into thyroid hormone because there's no iodine. Um, and so what happens is the lack of iodine decreases thyroid hormone levels. This triggers TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, to be secreted to basically say we need more thyroid hormone in the blood. So that goes to the thyroid and causes those thyroid hormone precursors to be made. Without iodine, they can never actually be made into functional thyroid hormone. And as you get a buildup of those precursors, we basically end up with a very large thyroid gland. We'll see a picture of it in a second here. Thyroid hormone is critical for normal growth as well as brain development early on in childhood. So if you have congenital hypothyroidism, usually this can be caused by some kind of poor developmental problem with the thyroid gland. The pituitary can have problems, maybe maternal medications that affect the thyroid growth and development pre-birth. Um, Sometimes it's asymptomatic or present with something like a weak cry in the baby, problems with them actually feeding, constipation, jaundice that's longer than normal, and thyroid hormone replacement is basically the only way to treat not having enough thyroid hormone. So here's an example of a lady that has a goiter right here. You can see the buildup. It's like a big lump, but instead of being a tumor here, it's just a buildup of that excess thyroid hormone in the colloid area, the thyroid hormone precursor in the colloid area. All right, if we have hypersecretion, so too much thyroid hormone, you get something like Graves' disease. Okay, and so basically, it's an autoimmune disease where the body abnormally makes antibodies that are directed specifically against the thyroid follicle cells. So we'll talk more about antibodies when we get into the chapters on the immune system and the lymphatic system. But basically, the body's immune system starts to attack the thyroid follicle cells. Okay, and obviously this is a problem because that's going to limit our ability to actually uh, uh, produce functional thyroid hormone. And actually, in this particular case, it's kind of the opposite of what you might think. The antibodies mimic thyroid stimulating hormone since they target those cells and will cause the thyroid to actually release too much thyroid hormone. So symptoms when you get too much thyroid hormone would be things like high metabolic rate, sweating, sometimes rapid or irregular heartbeats, nervousness, and weight loss, even though you're taking in enough calories. So plenty of caloric intake, but you're metabolizing that food too quickly. Um, Sometimes the eye actually will protrude forward because tissue behind the eyes becomes full of edema and fibrous. Um, so treatments pretty much include surgical removal of the thyroid or radioactive iodine that'll help destroy some of the thyroid cells so that you're not actually making as much thyroid hormone. So here's an example of the eye bulging that you sometimes get with Graves' disease because of the excess tissue, the fibrous tissue, and the edema that sits in the tissues behind the eyes. All right, calcitonin is very important. It's produced by the parafollicular cells in response to high calcium levels. So basically, it's the opposite of parathyroid hormone. The parathyroid is responsible for regulating calcium, okay? And so these parafollicular cells, in response to high levels of calcium, will actually make this calcitonin to antagonize or have the opposite effect of parathyroid hormone. We don't really know what happens physiologically when you just have normal physiologic levels, but when you do get high doses of calcium in your blood, you get more calcitonin. It inhibits osteoclast activity and prevents the release of calcium from the bone matrix. So if you remember from BIO201, osteoblasts lay down the bone matrix. They help to make that. Osteoclasts will actually chew up or eat up, resorb the bone so that we can use that calcium and get it to be released into the bloodstream. So it stimulates calcium uptake and incorporation into the bone matrix. All right, and so here's that picture of the thyroid gland. You can see the parafollicular cells here, which make calcitonin, compared to the follicular cells around the colloid, which are going to be important for secreting the thyroid hormone, and then ultimately getting that the fully processed, mature thyroid hormone back into the bloodstream. All right, the parathyroid hormone we just mentioned briefly comes from the parathyroid glands. Okay, and so these are little glands that sit totally within the thyroid. So you can see here these little nodules, essentially is what they look like, these little bumps along the thyroid. Okay. We have anywhere from 4 to 8 little yellowish brown embedded glands in the posterior portion of the thyroid, near the back of the neck. It varies from person to person how many you have. They contain oxyphil cells. You don't really need to know this for the test, but basically, the cells that we care more about are the parathyroid cells, and they basically make the PTH. And what I expect you to understand is that PTH is the most important hormone in your body for regulating how much calcium we have floating through the bloodstream. Okay, so it's the homeostasis regulator for blood calcium levels. It's secreted in response to low levels of calcium and blocked when we have high levels of calcium in the blood. So when your blood calcium level gets low, what happens is the parathyroid hormone is triggered. There's sensors in the blood that detect how much calcium is there. Okay, if there's not enough calcium to be the normal homeostatic levels, parathyroid hormone is produced, and as a result, the hormone is received by bone cells in the skeleton to take up some of that bone matrix so we can use the calcium, put it into the bloodstream. It's also going to affect the kidneys, affect how much calcium can actually be excreted, which we'll talk about when we get to the urinary system. And it will also have a target effect on the intestines. Okay, so here's that same picture, and you can see what the cells kind of look like there in the parathyroid. All right, so basically the parathyroid gland functions to stimulate osteoclasts to digest that bone matrix, enhance resorption of calcium and secretion of phosphate by the kidneys so we can hold on to as much calcium as possible, and promote activation of vitamin D by the kidneys to increase absorption of calcium by the intestines so we can take in more calcium. All right, so there's kind of a little diagram showing exactly what I just said. It is possible to have hyperparathyroidism, so too much parathyroid hormone. Usually that's due to some type of a tumor that's in the parathyroid gland. What happens is calcium is actually going to be pulled out of the bones too much, and typically the bones tend to soften and start to deform in susceptible areas of the skeleton because calcium's trying to be pulled out because of the excess amount of parathyroid hormone. Elevated calcium levels actually will block the nervous system and help to cause kidney stones. Sometimes you actually can get some other complications like different types of cysts that result in easily fractured bones. All right, you have hypoparathyroidism. Basically, this could happen like if there's a trauma to the gland, or maybe actually the gland's totally removed. What you end up with is hypocalcemia. Okay, so sometimes this results in tetany or respiratory paralysis, and sometimes if it's very extreme, you actually end up with death. Okay, moving on through some of the glands. The adrenal gland is next, and if you remember, physically, the adrenal gland sits right above the kidneys. Okay, superior to the kidneys on either side, and you'll understand why in a second when we talk about its function. So the adrenal glands, there's two of them, one above each kidney, are paired pyramid-shaped organs atop the kidneys. Sometimes they're called the super renal glands. All right, we're just going to call them the adrenal glands. So structurally and functionally, it is two different glands. Okay, that have one physical location. We have two areas: the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. And we've already talked about in the nervous system in 201 that that a cortex, like in the brain, typically is the outer region. Okay, and the medulla, kind of like the medulla oblongata of the brain, is the inner region. So we'll see that same terminology used here in the adrenal gland, where the adrenal cortex is the outer layer and the adrenal medulla is the inner layer. We'll see that term again when we get to other parts, other body systems in 202. So the adrenal cortex, that outer layer of the adrenal gland, has three layers of glandular tissue, so epithelial tissue, that synthesize and secrete several specific hormones. We call those the corticosteroids, okay? And then we also have the adrenal medulla, that deeper tissue, which is nervous tissue and actually part of the sympathetic nervous system. So the adrenal cortex, like I said, produces over 24 different hormones, so very important gland. Collectively, all those hormones we call the corticosteroids. And steroid hormones are not stored within the cells. Basically, the rate of release, how much of the hormones exist in your bloodstream, is all going to be based on how much is synthesized currently, how much is being made right now. So there are three different layers in the adrenal cortex, and each one is responsible for a group of corticosteroids. Okay, so in the zona glomerulosa, we make mineralocorticoids. In the zona fasciculata, we're going to make the glucocorticoids. In the zona reticularis, we're going to make the gonadocorticoids. Okay, and just like the name suggests, corticoids, cortex, so cortex steroids, essentially corticoids. All right, and are they mineral, gluco, so think sugar, right, like glucose, or gonado, think like gonads. All right, mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids, and gonadocorticoids. Okay, so here's showing those different regions: the reticularis, the fasciculata, and the glomerulosa. Okay, those different zones. And you can see here, here's the kidney and the adrenal glands, kind of that pyramid shape, or kind of a triangle almost, sitting on top of the kidney. And the cortex is the outer layer, the medulla is this deeper layer. Okay, so the mineralocorticoids regulate electrolyte concentration, so how much minerals you're retaining and what's going on with the amount of minerals that are able to float through your blood, okay, and how much is going to get filtered out by the kidneys. So they regulate electrolyte concentrations, primarily sodium and potassium, in the extracellular fluid. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more about the importance of calcium and sodium and that balance when we get into the kidneys and the urinary system. Very importantly, this includes aldosterone. Okay, it's the most potent mineralocorticoid. It stimulates sodium reabsorption, okay, by the kidney. So basically, we retain sodium in the blood. All right. This results in increased blood volume and, as a result, blood pressure. We'll talk about that as we get into the blood chapter, and then about the blood vessel chapter. Aldosterone also stimulates potassium elimination by the kidneys. So aldosterone, you keep sodium and causes you to release potassium in your kidneys. Okay, As a result, you get increased blood volume and blood pressure. The effects of aldosterone are very short-lived. They only last for a short period of time and stimulate the synthesis and activation of the sodium potassium ATPase transport pumps that help exchange sodium for potassium. We've talked about some of those already, and kind of the importance of some of those in other contexts, like in muscles and in the nervous system. So different factors regulate aldosterone secretion. We'll talk when we get into the kidneys and we get into the blood chapter a lot about the renin-angiotensin aldosterone mechanism that's very important for regulating blood pressure, among other things, about your blood and how your kidneys function. So that the aldosterone that's used there, that's made there, comes from the adrenal cortex. Some other factors that regulate aldosterone is actually how much potassium is in the blood, as well as ACTH levels and what we call ANP, or atrial natriuretic peptide. So I mentioned already the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism. So basically what happens is decreased blood pressure stimulates specific cells within the kidney that are going to cause them to produce a hormone called renin, okay, a chemical messenger called renin. Renin basically is going to cleave off or cut part of a plasma protein to make angiotensin. And this angiotensin is a potent stimulator of aldosterone. All right, so causes the adrenal gland to make aldosterone and secrete it. So plasma concentrations of potassium are very important. When you get higher amounts of potassium, this directly influences the zona glomerulosa and causes it to release aldosterone. So if you have higher amounts of potassium, it directly stimulates aldosterone release. If you have low levels of potassium, it directly inhibits aldosterone release. All right, and then as I mentioned, there are a few other things like ACTH and ANP that can also affect aldosterone. So here's kind of a chart showing some of the major mechanisms of how aldosterone is regulated. All right. In fact, we can have some problems related to aldosterone, like aldosteronism, which is basically hypersecretion, too much secretion of aldosterone due to some kind of adrenal tumor. All right, usually causes two major problems: hypertension and edema, because we have so much sodium left. We get a fluid buildup and a blood pressure increase, as well as excretion of too much potassium. And this causes, if you don't have enough potassium, the cells that rely on potassium, sodium potassium, to be polarized and depolarized that we talked about in 201, that would be the nervous system and the muscle cells. Those cells don't have the potassium they need to function normally. So basically you have non-responsive or abnormally unresponsive neurons and muscle cells due to lack of potassium, and you get hypertension and edema due to the excess sodium. All right, the next group of corticosteroids are the glucocorticoids. These are going to affect metabolism. So again, think sugar or glucose. They keep blood glucose levels relatively constant and maintain blood pressure by increasing the action of various vasoconstrictors. And we'll talk more about what vasoconstriction is as we get into the blood and the blood vessel chapters. But basically, changing the size of blood vessels. Glucocorticoid hormones would include things like cortisol, cortisone, several different similar hormones, so things that you see the word cortisol in. Cortisol is also called hydrocortisone when we use it outside of the body or medicinally. So cortisol is the only glucocorticoid that has any significant amount within the human body. All right, it's very important though for metabolism and regulating blood sugar levels. How does cortisol regulated, and how is its release regulated? So basically, cortisol is made in response and released in response to ACTH. ACTH is released in response to what we call CRH, or corticotropin releasing hormone. CRH is released when we have low cortisol levels. Increased cortisol levels will block ACTH as well as CRH because it has a negative feedback mechanism. And we've already talked about that, and we'll see that in most hormones. Um, so when you have acute stress, like an infection or some type of physical or emotional trauma, it very often interrupts the cortisol rhythm. And the central nervous system has the ability to override cortisol inhibition of ACTH or CRH. And this can actually cause us to make additional cortisol based on different nervous system inputs from the central nervous system. Cortisol is important because it causes an increase in blood levels of glucose, fatty acids, and amino acids. So basically, it metabolically causes gluconeogenesis, which we haven't talked about yet, but basically the formation of glucose from fats and proteins. So getting extra sugars. And this basically encourages cells to use fatty acids for fuel so that glucose is actually saved for the brain. So if there was ever stress or something like that happening and we're worried about not having enough sugar available, the central nervous system would be highly susceptible and would end up with brain damage if we did not have enough glucose. So other fuel sources are used to make sugar for the blood for the other organs, and glucose can be reserved for the brain. So other functions is involved in vasoconstriction again, which we'll talk about when we get into the blood. Excessive levels of glucocorticoids can be a problem because they can actually decrease cartilage and bone formation, and they can also block inflammation by decreasing different inflammatory chemicals that might be present. It tends to block the immune system or decrease its effects, and can cause problems with normal cardiovascular, neural, and gastrointestinal functions. All right, so in general, they're important, but they've got to be kept in check. Too much can cause a lot of different diseases and problems related to glucose sugar levels. Hypersecretion, we call this Cushing syndrome. And so basically it depresses cartilage and bone formation, the immune system. It blocks inflammation, can cause problems with the cardiovascular system and the GI tract. Usually it's caused by some type of tumor, like in the pituitary, lungs, pancreas, kidney, or adrenal cortex, or the overuse of corticosteroids, so synthetic steroids. Sometimes there's several signs that you can actually see of Cushing's. One of those would be what's called moon face, and another is what's called buffalo hump. We'll see a picture in a second. And so basically the way you treat them is removing the tumor or discontinuing the drugs that are causing too much. So whatever causes the hypersecretion. If you have hyposecretion, this is what's called Addison's disease. So usually this is a deficit in both glucocorticoids and mineralocorticoids. So what happens is there's a decrease in total plasma glucose as well as sodium levels. This causes weight loss, major dehydration, and hypotension. Okay, not hypertension, but hypo. And so you basically have to treat it by giving corticosteroid replacement therapy because the body can't make enough and can't release enough corticosteroids. You have to provide it for the bloodstream. Early signs actually can be a bronzing of the skin due to really high levels of ACTH, and this causes increased melanin production in the melanocytes. So it actually can change skin tone a little bit sometimes. So you can see here on the left a patient before the onset, and then on the right a Cushing's patient. As she's gotten older, she has that characteristic buffalo hump, so that lump on the back of her neck, on the upper back. Kind of an unimportant, unrelated side note that you might find interesting. One famous person that had Addison's disease was actually President Kennedy, and so he had some major health issues that were related to this. In the 1960s, we didn't really know how to treat this very well, so he had some health issues that kind of were hidden from the public for the most part. But you can imagine what it must be like having some issues not having corticosteroids, not having enough of them. Okay, the gonadocorticoids. Okay, so basically gonads, meaning the primary sex organs, the testes and the ovaries, These gonadocorticoids we would also call the adrenal sex hormones. Okay, so they are weak androgens, which are male sex hormones, that can be converted into testosterone in various tissues, as well as some that can be converted into estrogens. They may contribute to the onset of puberty and some of the appearance of secondary sex characteristics, which we'll get into all of that when we get into the reproductive chapters. It's also very important for sex drive in women, okay, because testosterone is the primary driver of sex drive, of libido. So in women, since they don't have testes to produce testosterone, much of that is going to come from these gonadocorticoids. It also is a major source of estrogens in postmenopausal women that are not producing estrogens from the ovaries. All right. Hypersecretion, so not enough of these sex type hormones from the adrenal gland. Often you end up with what's called adrenogenital syndrome or masculinization. It's not really very noticeable in adult males because basically the body's already producing testosterone from the testes, and so you're going to get the normal things like facial hair and deeper voice and some of the muscle tone and things like that. So having a little excess male androgen hormones doesn't really change much about the secondary sex characteristics. But in females or in boys that have not yet gone through puberty, so prepubertal males, the boys basically start getting mature reproductive organs before they normally would and start developing those secondary sex characteristics really early. In females, you can get excess facial hair. You actually can get a little bit of a beard. Sometimes you get a male pattern of body hair. And actually, the clitoris may resemble a small penis. So there's some malformation or changes physically just by having those excess sex characteristics, right? Because of the excess hormone. There are different cells within the medulla of the adrenal gland, so moving deeper inside of the adrenal gland. And they're really important because they produce epinephrine and norepinephrine. So primarily epinephrine, but also norepinephrine. And we call these collectively catecholamines. Okay, sorry about that. We call these collectively catecholamines. And what they basically do is they're responsible for vasoconstriction. Okay, so squeezing or getting smaller in the blood vessels. They cause increased heart rate. They increase the blood glucose levels, so you get more sugar available to use. And they can help divert blood to the brain, the heart, and the skeletal muscles from other tissues. So you may think, why would I want to have smaller blood vessels which would increase blood pressure? Why would I want increased heart rate, higher amounts of sugar in the blood, and why would I specifically move the blood to the brain, the heart, and skeletal muscles? Well, if you know much about epinephrine and norepinephrine, we typically think about the fight or flight response. So these medulla, this nervous system area of the adrenal gland, is going to be very important for fast response to various stresses. Okay, so both hormones have basically the same effects, but epinephrine is more of a stimulator of metabolic activities, where norepinephrine has an influence on the peripheral vasoconstriction and blood pressure. So either way, though, we think fight or flight type responses. So responses to stressors are brief, unlike adrenal cortical hormones. So adrenal medulla, it's the nervous system. So think the nervous system is faster acting communication. So it makes sense that the nervous tissue within the adrenal gland would actually be the one that produces the fast fight or flight type responses. And so here's kind of a little chart showing you short-term stress and then here long-term stress in the adrenal gland. Kind of broken down some of the things that we've already mentioned. So what happens when you get hyposecretion, so not enough epinephrine and norepinephrine? They're actually not essential to life, and therefore there are no actual problems if you don't get enough epinephrine and norepinephrine. However, if you get hypersecretion too much, you basically get the uncontrolled sympathetic nervous system. So things like hyperglycemia, so too much sugar, glycemia, increased metabolic rate, rapid heartbeat, very often heart palpitations, hypertension, very intense nervousness, and sweating. Okay, so basically think you're constantly in the fight or flight mode more than you need to be because you have too much of these hormones circulating. And so typically that's because of a problem within the medullary chromaffin cells, a specific cell type of the adrenal medulla. So here's kind of a chart showing the summary of the different effects of adrenal gland hormones. All right, and so then kind of the last few organs we'll talk about, the pineal gland. You probably mentioned this in 201. So it's a small gland that sits there just below, hangs down kind of below the third ventricle in the brain. It has special cells that secrete melatonin. Melatonin is made from serotonin. And basically, melatonin is really important because it's kind of a timing hormone. It may affect the timing of sexual maturity and when puberty will start. It's really important for regulating day and night cycles. So that's why there's some teas, herbal teas, and green teas and things of that nature that add melatonin in hopes that maybe that'll help regulate your night cycle. Melatonin also is important for physiological processes that have a normal rhythm, like your body temperature, your sleep pattern, when you have an appetite. So think time-sensitive things and having a regular repeating pattern when we think of melatonin and the pineal gland. Melatonin also can be important for producing antioxidants and detoxification of different things that exist in cells. Okay. So here you can see the pineal gland. So just kind of a refresher up here in the brain, we have the pineal gland. We've already talked about the hypothalamus and the pituitary, the thyroid and the parathyroid's back behind there on the posterior side. We really haven't discussed the thymus yet. There's the adrenal gland we just finished talking about, the pancreas, okay, and then the gonads, the testes for the males and the ovaries for females. Okay, so a few more of those organs the ones that I just mentioned. The pancreas. Okay, so pancreas has both endocrine and exocrine functions. All right, it's a triangle-shaped gland that's located behind the stomach. We'll talk about some really important non-endocrine functions or other types of functions when we get into the digestive tract. Okay, so it has acinar cells that are exocrine that produce enzyme-rich juices for digestion. And then it has islet cells, or sometimes they're called pancreatic islets or islets of Langerhans. And these are little pockets, little regions that contain endocrine cells that either produce insulin or glucagon. Okay, I don't expect you for this test to know the difference in alpha and beta cells or be able to identify them specifically, but just recognize that there's a specific group of cells that produce glucagon and another group of cells that produce insulin that are within these same pancreatic islets or the islets of Langerhans, this little area of tissue that's a pocket of endocrine cells. All right, and glucagon and insulin are very important. First, let's look at a picture here before we describe the hormones effects. So you can see here we have exocrine tissue actually around here. Here are the endocrine glands, okay, an islet. And you can see here we have alpha and beta cells producing glucagon or insulin. And then we have some acinar cells down here that are actually exocrine within these other tissues. So glucagon versus insulin. These are very important in regulating blood sugar. They have opposite effects. Okay, so obviously your body is going to trigger typically either glucagon or insulin, not both at the same time because they have opposite effects. Glucagon is extremely potent hyperglycemic agent. Okay, so it's triggered by the decrease in blood glucose levels. There's less sugar in your blood, as well as rising amino acid levels, or by the sympathetic nervous system directly. It causes an increase in blood glucose levels by targeting the liver to actually break down glycogen, that sugar storage, back into glucose. We call that glycogenolysis. We'll talk about that process a little bit when we get into the metabolism chapter. We're talking about digestion. It synthesizes glucose from lactic acid and other different non-carbohydrate chemicals that exist in your body. So basically, it's going to make sugar. that's called gluconeogenesis, and ultimately puts glucose back into the blood. So when you think glucagon is made when there's not much sugar in the blood, or it's a lower than a homeostatic level, and glucagon is going to cause the release of sugar into the bloodstream to get back to homeostasis. Insulin is the opposite. It's secreted when blood glucose levels are high. Okay, it's actually made as a what's called proinsulin, basically a precursor molecule, and gets modified into actual active insulin. And basically what it does is it enhances membrane transport of glucose into fat and muscle cells. So we get rid of sugar out of the blood by moving them into fat or moving them into muscle cells. It stops glycogen being made into glucose, so we aren't going to make sugar in our body because there's already enough in the bloodstream. And it's going to block the conversion of amino acids or fats into glucose. All right. Insulin is not needed for glucose uptake in the liver and the kidney or the brain. Okay, so those key organs there don't require insulin. Insulin also plays a role in development of neurons and different things with the nervous system. It's also very important for learning and memory. Insulin also can trigger cells to basically use glucose for ATP production to make glucose into that storage sugar called glycogen, as well as converting glucose into fat, which is going to happen in the adipose tissue, the fat tissue. Okay, so glucagon is going to be when you have low blood sugar causing body cells to release glucose back into the bloodstream. Insulin is going to cause is when you have higher glucose or sugar in the bloodstream, and is going to cause you to pull in that sugar to either be used first for energy and make ATP, and secondarily to be stored either as glycogen or fat. All right. So several things can affect the release of insulin. All right. You can have elevated blood glucose levels. That's the main thing that affects insulin levels. Also, rising blood levels of different amino acids and fatty acids. You can have the parasympathetic nervous system, different hormones like glucagon, epinephrine, growth hormone, thyroxine, and glucocorticoids. And also the sympathetic nervous system can help to inhibit insulin release. So if we think about homeostasis, we could easily think about blood sugar levels and what happens if you get too much or too little blood sugar. The liver and the pancreas are going to work together. The pancreas essentially to help initiate the response, either producing insulin or glucagon, and then ultimately putting the sugar levels back into balance in the bloodstream. All right. If you have problems with blood sugar levels, particularly with insulin, we end up with diabetes. Diabetes mellitus can be due to hyposecretion of insulin. Okay, we call that type 1, or hypoactivity of insulin. We call that type 2. Sometimes type 1 is called juvenile onset. Okay, because it can happen early on in life, where hypoactivity of insulin, or type 2, typically happens because of the body no longer responding to insulin because there's already so much. The system's kind of overwhelmed and can't really use the hormone to tell the body to do what it's already doing at full capacity. All right, so there are three main signs of diabetes. Polyuria, so a very large urine output. Basically, glucose, if you have lots of sugar, helps to tell the body to get rid of sugar by releasing more water, so causes you to pee more or produce more urine. You can have polydipsia, which is basically excessive thirst, and that's because you have lots of water loss due to the polyuria. And you can have polyphagia, which is excessive hunger and food consumption because cells can't actually take up the glucose, so they feel like they're starving, and hunger sensations are going to eventually kick in. So when sugars cannot be used as fuel, like in diabetes, fats get used instead. And so this causes what's called lipidemia, or high levels of fat in the blood. And if you get enough of that, the fatty acid metabolism will result in the formation of ketones or ketone bodies. And if you get too much ketones, they're very acidic, and so your blood gets acidotic, or basically you get too much acid in your blood. We call this ketoacidosis. Okay, and so it's common in diabetics because your body is switching to trying to use more fat for energy because it can't utilize the sugar because it's not responding to the insulin, or there's no insulin there to respond to. Um, so sometimes you get some of these acidic ketone bodies as well as in urine because there's more of it in the blood. If you get untreated ketoacidosis, this can cause hypernia, disrupted heart activity, and oxygen transport, severe depression of the nervous system, and possibly even cause coma or, in extreme cases, death. So it's very important not to get too acidic due to ketones. So that's something that diabetics have to be careful about. All right. The opposite, we can have hyperinsulinism. So basically the opposite of diabetes. This is excessive insulin secretion, and it causes hypoglycemia, so low blood glucose levels. So typically, if you don't have enough sugar in your blood, you end up with anxiety, nervousness, sometimes disorientation. Again, if it gets severe enough, unconsciousness or death. And so basically, the way that hyperinsulinism is treated is by increased sugar intake. All right, so here's kind of showing you how diabetes works, the basic way insulin works, and what happens when you have diabetes as a result of insulin deficiency. All right, and here's a nice little video you can take some time to watch on your own, kind of showing you some more details and explaining in a different way what I just said about how blood glucose levels or blood sugar is regulated. All right, last few organs, the gonads, which we'll spend a lot of time talking about in the reproductive tract chapter. Gonads produce the same sex steroid hormones as those of the adrenal cortex, just in lesser amounts. So ovaries are going to produce estrogens and progesterone. Ovaries obviously are going to be in females. Estrogen is really important for maturing the different reproductive organs, as well as the appearance of secondary sexual characteristics. Progesterone is very important for the development of breasts, and cyclic changes that happen within the uterus during the monthly cycle. We'll talk about more of how that works and why that is. But estrogen and progesterone together are produced by the ovaries and have very important effects. The testes, okay, so the male gonads are going to produce testosterone. This initiates the maturation of all male reproductive organs and will cause the secondary male sexual characteristics as well as sex drive for both sexes. Obviously, the sex drive testosterone is going to be made more by the testes in males, and in females, it's going to have to be made exclusively by the different androgens made exclusively by the adrenal cortex. All right. So testosterone is necessary for normal sperm production, and it's going to maintain reproductive organ function in just a normal state. All right, and then finally, actually, when we talk about pre-birth, okay, so the gestational period, so between conception, when a sperm and an egg come together to make a new human, from there until the point of birth, we don't have the same normal structures as the structures start being developed. And so at a certain point in pregnancy, which we'll talk about in chapter 27, we start to develop something called the placenta. And you may think of the placenta as like your umbilical cord that came in to make your belly button. But we'll find out it's a lot more than that. The placenta actually is a very important endocrine organ which secretes estrogen, progesterone, and a hormone called HCG, the human chorionic gonadotropin, which will regulate a lot of different things that are happening for the growing fetus as well as the mom's reproductive tract. All right. There's some other organs that actually also produce some very specific hormones. Adipose tissue, so fats, make leptin, resistin, and adiponectin, which are very important regulators of things with metabolism. The GI tract makes different hormones that we'll talk a little bit about as we get into the GI tract. They're going to be important things like ghrelin that'll affect stomach stimulating food intake. Um, Secretin, which will help to stimulate the liver and the pancreas to start digesting food. All right, the heart makes what's called atrial natriuretic peptide, or ANP, and this is going to be important to decrease the amount of sodium in the blood, and that'll affect blood pressure and blood volume. We'll talk about that a little more when we get to the heart and to the blood chapters. And then the kidneys are going to make erythropoietin, which helps to stimulate red blood cell development in the bone marrow, as well as renin, which we'll talk about again a couple more times through this semester, which is an important part of that renin angiotensin aldosterone axis, that mechanism of regulating sodium potassium levels, which will affect blood pressure and blood volume. The skeleton makes some of its own hormones. So osteoblasts, for example, will make osteocalcin. The skin is going to make calcitrol and several other hormones. These are really important for vitamin D. The thymus is really big in infants and children, and actually starts to get smaller as we get older rather than bigger. And it's going to make a few hormones as well. So sometimes we consider these paracrines because they act more locally. I remember a hormone just means that it's going to be a chemical that travels through the blood to affect its target organs. A paracrine is going to act locally, it doesn't have to go through the blood circulation. So the thymus is very important for the immune system, and we'll talk about that more in the immune system chapters. All right, and finally, when we think about the developmental aspects of the endocrine system, where do the different endocrine organs come from? A lot of it is going to depend on the function and the tissue type that is actually making the hormone. So we've talked about most hormones we think of as being endocrine and being epithelial, but there are some that are nervous system. Okay, so hormone-producing glands arise actually from all three germ layers. And so we'll talk about these different germ layers, the three different kind of groupings or layers of tissues that exist in the growing fetus during development. And basically, all three layers are going to help contribute to specific glands. Most endocrine organs operate well into old age. Growth hormone levels obviously go down as you get older, and obviously you're not going to grow as much once you're going to have a high amount of growth hormone when you go through puberty. After that, it's going to go down some. That's going to be more dramatic as you get older, and it can account for muscle atrophy. Thyroid hormone is also going to decrease with age, which causes a lower basal metabolic rate. So you may think somebody who's 20 has high metabolism compared to somebody who's 40 or 50 or 60. There is some truth in that because actually your metabolism does slow down, and one reason is a decrease in thyroid hormone. The parathyroid hormone levels pretty much stay constant with age, but if you get less estrogen, like what happens in older women after menopause, it causes them to be more vulnerable to demineralization of the bone because parathyroid hormone is trying to pull calcium out into the bloodstream. So that's one reason that osteoporosis and osteopenia, where the bones are more brittle due to less calcium, tend to occur more in women after menopause when there's less estrogen to kind of counteract and handle what happens with the parathyroid hormone. All right, glucose tolerance tends to deteriorate with age. And then the ovaries undergo significant changes with age and become unresponsive to the different gonadotropins. And there can be different problems associated with estrogen deficiencies. We'll talk a little bit more about that again when we get into the reproductive chapters. And then finally, testosterone also is going to decrease with age. So we'll talk about this when we get into reproduction. The male technically can make sperm throughout life, but typically testosterone levels decrease as the man ages, and this can affect sperm production and can also decrease other things in the body that are stimulated by testosterone. Usually that's not seen until very, very old age. All right. Don't forget quiz one that is due technically by January 10th, but I won't actually take it down for Mastering A&P until the 17th. I'm giving you an extra week there. If for some reason you have issues logging into Mastering A&P or have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email or talk to me on Friday. Thanks, and I'll talk to you soon.